They were delighted to have with us Jeffrey Smith, who is the executive director for the Institute for Responsible Technology. He's written a number of books, of which he'll expand on, but I think his leading characteristic and attribute is that he is probably the single leading individual and force in the United States responsible for helping limit the spread and actually eliminate the spread of GMO crops in the United States. It's been, as he'll get into, I'm sure, it's been successfully done in Europe, and he's leading the charge in the United States to see that, make sure that happens in this country, and we're behind him and supporting him in his endeavors. So I'm really excited to have him today because he's going to really open probably many of your eyes to some areas you may not have been aware of. So thank you and welcome for joining us, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
All right. So maybe you can mention to your readers, or listeners rather, some of your books so that we can, that they can know what you've written.
I wrote the book Seeds of Deception and also Genetic Roulette, and have the videos Hidden Dangers in Kids' Meals and Your Milk on Drugs, Just Say No.
Okay, great. So those, obviously those are available for more information, but I think this interview will give us a really some good tidbits. So let's start with some interesting factoids. You write about GM corn chips and how they might transform our gut bacteria into living pesticide factories. And that's pretty interesting because corn chips, tortilla chips, they're pervasive. Most of us see them at parties and bars, and we crunch on them. So what are we risking when we actually consume these?
Well, this is, of all the things that I talk about, the fact that we might convert our intestinal bacteria into living pesticide factories may be the highest in the yuck factor. I mean, when I speak, I show pictures of testicles that changed color from pink to blue in rats that ate genetically modified soy. I show a 5-fold increase in infant mortality among babies of mothers that were fed GM soy, and smaller babies, and thousands of sick, sterile, and dead livestock. But of all the things that I talk about, the question that I get the most on is, well, how do I know if my intestinal bacteria is a living pesticide factory? So here's the backstory. The only human feeding study ever published on genetically modified foods showed that genes that were inserted into soybeans. Now, soybeans are genetically engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide, so they're called Roundup-ready soybeans. And they have a gene from bacteria inserted into the DNA of the soy, which allows them to survive otherwise deadly doses of Roundup herbicide. So they took 7 volunteers, and 3 of the 7 volunteers, turns out they looked inside the gut bacteria and they had the gene that was inserted into the soy that sometime in some previous meal had transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside their intestines and continued to function, even long after they stopped eating genetically modified soy. Now, this is there has some serious medical implications, and we'll talk about that. But this was a government-funded study in the UK, and the UK is very pro-GM, and as soon as they found this, they never funded the follow-up to see if the genes from corn, which are genetically engineered to produce an insecticide called Bt toxin, they never checked to see if those two also transfer and continue to pump out this insecticide or toxin inside our intestines.
Well, but before we go further, I'd just like to give a perspective, because I mentioned genetically modified corn chips, and we basically have 2 primary crops, corn and soy. And about 13, 14 years ago, prior to the introduction of the GM crops, there was maybe, or about that time, it was maybe 2% of those total crops were genetically modified. And I'm wondering, as we're ending the first quarter of 2010, if you could let our listeners know what the percentage is of corn and soy that is now genetically modified. Because I think that's a constantly moving target, and there's probably no one better qualified for you to answer that.
Well, it's about 85% of the corn in the United States is genetically engineered either to produce an insecticide or survive applications of herbicide, and about 91 to 93% of the soybean crop is genetically engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide. So essentially, if you buy a corn or soy derivative, something that's like soy oil or soy flour or soy lecithin, high fructose corn syrup, it comes from mixing in a lot of corn from the harvest. And so unless it says organic or non-GMO, it is most definitely largely genetically engineered.
And from your experience, is it fairly accurate to say that if it has the green USDA organic certification or non-GMO, that's pretty strong assurance that it's not going to contain this?
Well, we can say that efforts have been made to eliminate or minimize the contamination. We can't say it's 100% free of contamination because the pollen doesn't read the signs as it's flowing through the air. And fortunately, there's a new third-party verified system that requires testing and has a low acceptable threshold. That's called the Non-GMO Project. And you'll be seeing more and more seals saying Non-GMO Project verified on products this year. But right now, the best we can do is organic and non-GMO labels.